This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest, Julian Gill, author of Aerosmith on Tour, 1973 to 85. Aerosmith on Tour focuses on the touring history of one of rock's legendary bands, based on local reviews of the shows and the contemporaneous critical perception of the band. This first volume of Aerosmith on Tour covers the band's early grind as they sought to establish themselves on the rock and roll landscape through the successes and internal turmoil, ending with the successful 1984 reunion. Also covered are the offshoot bands, the Joe Perry Project, and Whitford St. Holmes, and classic-era discographies. This is an unofficial and unsanctioned work 15 years in the making. It's packed full of hundreds of tour ads, concert ticket stubs, set lists, and reviews. Julian Gill is the host of the KISSFAQ podcast and author of over 15 books on Kiss, including Kiss on Tour 1973 to 2017, Odyssey, the definitive examination of music from the Elder, Kiss's cult classic concept album, and Gene, Ace, Peter, and Paul, a detailed exploration of the 1978 Kiss solo albums. Julian has also released the 2008 Def Leppard book, Leppard Tracks, Misty Dreamers, 1977 to 2008. To hear a playlist of Aerosmith, including the music discussed in this episode, just head over to the show notes page. Julian, thanks so much for being on the Booked on Rock podcast.
Eric, thanks a lot for inviting me. It's a real honor to get to join your podcast and talk about the book.
Many listeners will recognize your name and your voice, especially Kiss fans. You are the host of the KISSFAQ podcast and author of over 15 books on Kiss. Your latest is on Aerosmith. This is a project 15 years in the making. What sparked the idea to begin this project and specifically on Aerosmith?
Well, when I was doing research on one of the Kiss books, and this goes back to the 90s, actually, I was doing a touring history on that band at the same time. Another pair of authors were working on their own book on this. So I was finding ads, and Aerosmith was often mentioned in them as well. So I had a similar love for that band. And I just started putting those notes away for, if I ever got down the road where I wanted to do something, that I had material available. And I also would get to see how much material there was available and whether it would be worth developing into a similar sort of project for Aerosmith.
I see you've got the Boston Red Sox cap on. I'm a New England guy. I'm a Sox guy. Are you from the area? Right now, I think you're living on the West Coast, right?
Yes, I'm actually from Old England, not New England. I do have an affinity with Boston and New England. I spent 1978 to 88 living in upstate New York, was never a fan of any of the New York teams. Trying to break the curse appealed to me. And for this hat itself, it's actually my bootlegging hat, because back in the days where I used to tape shows, I had a little camera, and it was the best hat for cutting a little hole in to have a camera poking out of one of the Bs.
Oh, I love it. I love it. So that's the story behind the Boston Red Sox cap. Okay, because I thought maybe there was a connection there. So Aerosmith, when did you become a fan?
85, I became a fan, because like everything else with me, I was living in England. I grew up in England. I came to America, and I didn't immediately get into American rock. So it was MTV era. All my friends in high school were excited about Back in the Saddle and all of that. So I'd followed that in magazines. And once the album came out for the reunion, I was all in. So it was an exciting time to be a fan for someone who hadn't known anything about what was going on in the 1970s. It was all fresh, like they were being reborn. They were suddenly coming good again. So it was a very exciting time, and it was impossible not to be interested, especially when that first music video hit.
Yeah, this is around the time I think the Run DMC collaboration took place, and Aerosmith is just about to take off again.
Well, it was before that. Run DMC isn't even in the picture at the time I'm becoming a fan. I became a fan during probably one of their largest commercial failures, because Done With Mirrors was really an unsuccessful album. When Run DMC came out, I wasn't that interested in the marriage of rap and rock. It didn't do much for me for what I was starting to listen to at that time. So I glossed over it. Permanent Vacation came out. I really liked that album. But once I went back into the catalog, I found where I was most comfortable. I found where I belonged, and I found the music that I would never have otherwise experienced growing up.
Yeah, early Aerosmith, it is wonderfully dirty, raw. That's rock and roll at its best.
Yeah, and with my background, coming from England, having family who were Liverpudlians or born in Liverpool, raised near the area, my roots were more out of the Beatles. So Aerosmith took me on that other path towards the Stones and that more bluesy path from the Roots. So it was a new experience for me musically. And it was just one that stayed with me ever since. You know, while I may be known for doing Kiss books, and I also did one on Def Leppard, my musical tastes do embrace all of these different styles and genres.
You state right up front in the introduction in this book that this is not intended to be a biography. It's not about the dirt. This is essentially a celebration of Aerosmith history on the road. You rebuild the band's itinerary show by show to know where they were, what they were doing musically. The book is packed with concert ticket stubs, show ads, visual artifacts throughout. How did you go about collecting all of these items? How much of them are yours? How much are from other fans?
Every scan of an object in there, be it a ticket, an album cover, or some promotional type item, is from my own collection. And I've just collected throughout the years. Singles I always loved because I always liked comparing single edits with the album version. So lots of fans had those for different reasons. I just did it because I wanted to record them and compare. Ticket stubs, I just collect on eBay, but I also looked throughout the book. Where was I missing an image? Where did I have a gap? Where was I not able to find a concert flyer or an ad or something that I thought would be visually helpful to that section? Or if you want to take it as far as a space filler that, has purpose. So all of the stubs are mine. They sit in a drawer. I was adding to them continuously because not having been to too many shows throughout the years, it's always nice to hold those objects that fans took with them for entry into Electrical Sin.
Before getting to the band's touring history, you do include throughout the book information on the band's history along the way. Can you give readers a background, those who may not be super familiar with Aerosmith and their history, where they met, how they formed? There's a famous story of Steven Tyler meeting Joe Perry at an ice cream parlor in New Hampshire, which is a great story.
Yeah, so the band forms in the summer of 1970. Everything is rotating around the barn. The barn is where these guys played, whether it was Joe and his pre-Aerosmith bands, the Jam Band, Plastic Glass, or Steven with his plethora of bands, the Chain Reaction, Strangers even. Everything was there. Everything happened in Sunapee, New Hampshire, which is one of the most beautiful parts of the world that I've ever visited. I'm really thrilled that I can still go there like I did last year in 2021 and go and see the barn and go and see the Anchorage. The Anchorage was the cafe where Joe worked as a teenager and where he first met Steven. And he was, I think, chucking French fries in the kitchen. And Steven was at that point a little bit of a rock star, having been in the Chain Reaction, released a couple of singles and opened for bands like the Byrds and the Yardbirds and the Beach Boys as well, I think. So what I wanted to do with these little narrative sections was tell that story to introduce each tour, to not bog it down, like you said, by reading some of the intro. I don't want to do dirt because I wasn't there. That's the band's story to tell or not to tell, and one that they've already told in Walk This Way and in their own autobiographies. So I don't need to rehash any of that because, number one, I can't factually prove or disprove it. Those are their memories. And as an outsider, I wanted to be respectful. But I did want to set up what they'd been doing prior to that period of touring that's covered chapter by chapter.
You did take some shots of the guys' early homes, I believe. Are those your pictures, Stevens?
Yeah, they are.
Yeah,
I felt like a complete stalker. I went to Joe's house, his old house and his newer house, because it was right across the street from his old house that his parents built right at the end of his teens. So I wanted to just set a little bit of the scene of this is where they grow up, just to show, again, it's a picture to go in the book to go with the story of talking about Joe's youth, and then Charico and where Steven spent his summers and the lawn that they've talked about, him mowing and Joe pulling up in his MG, just to give people who are consumers of the story, the visuals. They will have seen these places, but I also wanted to stand there. I wanted to stand in the spot where Joe's car pulled up in front of the wall and imagine Steven mowing the lawn. It was important for me to kind of, touch the holy water.
I'm looking at it now. Yeah, boy, that is a nicely cut lawn, isn't it?
It's
whoever owns
a
it.
lovely cottage. Absolutely beautiful. I could happily live and retire there. Again, I was just out there for a week doing a rapid tour to go and sit and stand in all of these places, or as many as I could. And because Aerosmith is not an urban band, many of these places are still there. Many of the first places that they performed are still physically there. So we're very lucky as a historian and able to go and experience musical archaeology.
By the way, you even note in the book, it says Tro Rico, and in parentheses, with a nicely mown lawn. I love it.
Yeah, I have to have a little bit of fun like that. There's a few quirks throughout the book, and that's just me trying to put in a little bit of style to freshen it up, because otherwise it would just be a long list of tour dates. And I wanted this book to be more than just a list. If you want to see a list of tour dates, they're all over the internet in various degrees of accuracy. And I'll say the same about mine, because I do also say in the beginning, it is not 100% complete because I was not there. They were doing shows all over the place in the early days, and not all were recorded.
Before we get to those dates, let's talk about some of the guys in the band. The lineup, by the way, the classic lineup of Aerosmith: Steven Tyler on lead vocals, Joe Perry on lead guitar, Brad Whitford on guitar, Tom Hamilton on bass, Joey Kramer on drums. Steven Tyler, known early on by his birth name Steven Tallarico, was often compared to Mick Jagger in the early days, actually the pre-Aerosmith very, very early days, because as you said, he was in a band before Aerosmith, a few bands. The Strangers, they opened for the Byrds March 26th at the Westchester County Center, and you include a quote from a review dated March 28th, 1966, from the Yonkers Herald-Statesman, quote, "Lead singer Steven Tallarico came on like Mick Jagger of the Stones, bottom lip hanging, tambourine slapping against his thigh." I wonder if that comparison bothered Steven. Has he ever talked about it in interviews?
He has. And he's mentioned, I think it's during the Get a Grip era in particular, that either he'd finally found peace with it and he didn't care anymore. He said, of course I wanted to be like Mick Jagger. That was the height of success, was to be like Mick Jagger. And yes, we had similarities. So what does it matter? I mean, a lot of the reviewers used their vocabularies to be cutting and biting and nasty. And it was an art form for them because they were just exercising their writing, being as negative as they wanted to, either mocking Steven for his physical attributes, calling him the bastard child of Mick Jagger and Carly Simon, all sorts of horrid things without talking about the music. So that Yonkers review, I find the slapping the tambourine more interesting than any of the physical descriptions of his characteristics, because his passion, yeah, you bet he was slapping that tambourine.
Well, and he's the real deal rock star, too. You write about how he was a hyperactive child, involved in mischief from the time he could walk, thrown out of Roosevelt High School in Yonkers, New York, one of 10 students arrested on assorted warrants for marijuana offenses on the evening of March 15th, 1967. These are all the great little details in your book, which I love. He really was destined to be a bad boy rock and roller.
Without a doubt. And I think there were more early press mentions of him for arrest than there are for music. So that's an interesting one as well. Yeah, he's an artist, though. He's an artist, a free spirit. I don't want to even say wild child. That sounds good when you're a kid, but you're a free spirit and an artist when you're older.
And you include an entry in the chapter on the pre-Aerosmith recordings, which caught my interest. Steven Tallarico, "I'm Down" from 1970. What is the story behind this song?
So there's a couple of different versions. I tried to go back as far as I could to find the first time the story was told, that apparently he was trying to audition. Jeff Beck was putting a new band together as one version, but I guess it could be he needed a demo tape of some description, and he got some of the local musicians, so Pudge, Tom Hamilton, and Joe Perry, to back him on a recording of "I'm Down," which is, of course, a Beatles song that was later recorded by Aerosmith for Permanent Vacation. So it provided a nice bit of continuity for the very beginnings of the band musically and what they later did. So in 1987, I'm sitting there going, why are they covering the Beatles? I thought they were a Rolling Stones analog. Well, Now I knew that, and hopefully if anyone else didn't, they do as well. And if not, I want this to be as complete as possible. So it's one of the early recordings and one that I would really like to hear.
As for his future songwriting partner, Joe Perry, he wasn't interested in music right away. In fact, he was interested in becoming a marine biologist when he was a kid. He idolized Jacques Cousteau.
Who would have thought?
Picturing Joe Perry as a marine biologist. Hard to picture.
Yeah, it's very hard to picture. But then again, it's not particularly surprising when you look at Hopedale, Massachusetts, when you look at the areas of New England, they're outdoors. There's lakes. It's beautiful. You're not indoor. It's not like 2021. It's not like it's probably closer to 1985 than anything. That everyone was outdoors, enjoying outdoors. So there was hunting, there was motorbike scrambling, and his thing was apparently that interest. I find it very odd. When you think of Joe, you always think of him as how he appeared on stage, kind of surly, head down, eyes behind the hair, and you can't imagine him saying, "Oh, a starfish."
But there it is. It's documented. Aerosmith's first professional gig, November 6th, 1970, at Nipmuc Regional High School's gym in Mendon, Massachusetts. Can you talk about that show, what the set list was? And there is a big blow-up between Steven and Joe after the gig.
Well, let's start with the blow-up. It's the same thing. You're too damn loud. Joe wanted to play loud. Steven wanted to hear himself. And there is the friction that's continued to this day. Joe plays loud. Steven plays artistically. So it's the yin and yang right from the beginning. You're not rehearsing. You want to be heard. You want everything to be heard. But Joe wanted to play. And what about the material that they played? Well, it's a lot of the covers that they would later record on albums, and some of which didn't make albums. Rattlesnake Shake, Peter Green, incredible, great bluesy song. Fantastic performance, big 10-inch record. Think About It, which was later done right at the tail end of Joe's first tenure with the band. All that stuff that they were doing, covers, but it has a couple of original songs. And again, we have to take that information with a pinch of salt. It's sourced from the Walk This Way book, and that's what they report was their first set list. But I've heard all sorts of different songs that have been mentioned in relation to the first year. So there may be some conflation between songs that were performed. Again, I wasn't there. I can only go by what's reported. But how amazing it would have been to be a fly on the wall at that time.
An interesting quote from Joe Perry you include in the book regarding those early days. Talked about how they chose to play at high schools mostly out of town, 2 sets, half covers, half originals. So they were determined, not just a covers band. They wanted to go somewhere.
Absolutely. They didn't want to get stuck in that grind of 6 sets a night. Eventually they had to go through the grind in order to become better performers, to become a better band. But at least they were doing that at little venues where they could do their own music, do their own thing without the constraints of being in a club and having the audience expect to recognize what you're performing. Naturally, they start off early on with a higher proportion of cover material because they didn't have their own. That didn't come immediately. They had a couple of bits and pieces ready, and that's it. But as they get more, the balance shifts. But they could still pull out these covers when they needed to, and they were a performing band, but they weren't going to be a bar band.
Julian Gill's new book, Aerosmith on Tour, 1973 to 85, is out now. There was a member of the band that wouldn't last long. Who was Raymond Tabano, and why was his time in the band so short?
Raymond Tabano is a fascinating character. He's there at the beginning. He grew up with Steven Tyler. They were both buddies when they were kids, and Raymond's a little bit older than Steven. So he was also in bands, and they shared a musical passion. They liked a lot of the same acts, and it was natural that when Aerosmith formed, Tom came in with Joe. So Steven needed to have someone come in with him to keep a certain amount of balance, and there was always competition going. And he also had a role to fulfill as the second guitarist in the band, and Joe was amenable to there being a second player since he knew what he was going to be doing, and Ray was perfectly capable of being a rhythm guitarist. Now, he doesn't survive, unfortunately. He had other things going on. He had other activities that were part of his life, but the band were growing faster than he could.
He was out around 71, 72?
71, yeah, around Labor Day. It happens during the summer, again, at the barn back in Sunapee. The band go up there to do a show. They also go and see another band playing, Joe Jammer. And that's where they see Brad Whitford. So long story short, Raymond gets the heave-ho and Brad comes in. Funnily, Raymond ends up in Brad's spot in the other band. So it wasn't a happy ending for Raymond, because obviously Aerosmith goes on to greater and bigger things than he did musically, but he also had different dreams and different desires, and then made the most of his opportunities when they came along.
What did he end up going on to do after Aerosmith and the next band he joined?
He went into a different career after Aerosmith for many years. Last I saw, I didn't really talk to him too much about what he'd done outside of the band. I know he'd had a cooking business at one point, catering. And then, of course, he did get back into music in the 90s. And you can actually go and listen to some of his music on Spotify.
Being from Connecticut, there is one part of the early Aerosmith story that really stands out. This is around 1971. They're offered a residency at a place called the Shabu Inn. This is in Willimantic, Connecticut. Legendary club. Open from 71 till 82. Cheap Trick, Journey, Tom Petty, Dire Straits, AC/DC. They all played there. Aerosmith was traveling around in a bread truck at this time. They played to a few hundred Wednesday night. By the end of the week, it was jammed with people. And I have read that Aerosmith played Dream On for the first time ever at the Shabu Inn. Have you ever heard that?
I heard the story. Again, it's impossible to confirm with any degree of absolute certainty. So that's what firsthand accounts recollect 50 years down the road. So it is what it is for that. And you know what? Wherever Dream On was played first is a very special place. And if Shabu gets it, it was a legendary club. So it certainly gets something very useful.
I had a coworker who's since retired, but I got to reach out to him to find out if this was the place, because he said, and he used to be in bands himself, and he was playing at a club in Connecticut, and this band is playing that night that they were opening for, and they didn't know much of them, but they said the band's name is Aerosmith, and he said he was blown away by it. And then after the show, the guys had a few beers with him and chatted, and they were all really cool guys. But he said when I saw this band play, he knew they were going somewhere. They were tight, and you could tell they put the time in.
Absolutely. That's one of the recurring themes that comes across the few reviews that really come from the early period, is how driven they were, how motivated they were. When you hear the stories of them traveling around in that Harvester van or in the school bus, like a B-17 crew flying over Germany in World War II with holes shelled through it and freezing. They really were soldiers of fortune seeking musical destiny. And the area, the snow, you can just come up with the visuals that shows how passionate they were. And then you listen to a song like Dream On, and now that the 1971 The Road Starts Here has been released, people can hear some of the very earliest versions of that and just hear how exquisite it was 50 years ago, 2 years before it ever got recorded, is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, actually I have an interview coming up soon with a guy who ran a record store. First time he heard Dream On, he could not believe that it wasn't a hit right away. And then a few years later, there was, I think it was when Toys in the Attic hit, the Dream On took off, or maybe it was the album before that. But I think they were on their third album by the time Dream On actually starts getting radio airplay, right?
Yeah, end of 75, Dream On hits big, right in time for Rocks. It had been a minor hit throughout the Northeast in 73, so it had had a chance. Raymond had mentioned when he was interviewed that he thought it was because there was another similar song doing well on the charts at the time. That is why it didn't succeed. It was too similar in style to that other song. So I'd like to identify what that was in 1973, just from my own knowledge. But you know what? A hit is always going to be a hit. There is destiny. That song, all it needed was that second chance at a right time. And it was what the band then needed, and it propelled them. Again, it's the difference between being stars and being superstars.
Early on, the band's name is 2 words, which I didn't know this. Aero, then Smith. And you include what I believe are newspaper clippings, ads promoting the gigs, and it is 2 words, AERO, and then SMITH. There's even one that's spelled Arrow, Smith, and that's from the Shabuin gigs, actually. When did they change it to just the now iconic one-word name?
They never did. Other people spelt it how they thought it was. At times they thought Aerosmith was Errol Smith, a person.
Somebody spelled it Ano Smith?
Yeah, Eno Smith. Yeah. So again, these are people who are maybe on a telephone saying, hey, we've got this band, Aerosmith, who's going to come in, and you hear it over a phone, and it's crackly, and it's just spelled how they think they heard it or how they think it should be spelled. It was always one word. That's how Joey came up with it. They never changed it. It was other people who spelled it wrong, and it was always getting spelled incorrectly in newspaper ads. But again, it doesn't matter. As long as people come to the show, I guess you can spell it however you want.
That's it, yeah. And drummer Joey Kramer, he's the one who came up with the name. Inspired by a Harry Nilsson album called Aerial Ballet. And there was also a printing error on the early pressing of that debut album, right?
Yeah, on the very first pressing, they misspelled dog. So it's Walking the Dig. I don't know how many copies that ended up on. They did correct it, and there were several versions of that album. By the time we get to 76, it's been reissued and new covers and all that. So not surprising. It happens.
The other thing was the punk paragraph removed from the bio.
Yeah, there was a bio on the back of the first pressing, and it started getting chipped away at. They would take out that they were a punk band or juvenile delinquents and make it more consumer friendly with each printing. So it got shortened by about half by the time we get to the third pressing of that.
And Joe Perry was given a backup vocal credit. That was another correction. And David Woodford additionally credited on Write Me. Let's see.
That's right.
Also added on the bottom of the rear cover is Joyce McGregor's credit for the front cover lettering. That's cool stuff, man, that you have in here.
Yeah, that's the sort of minutia I want to sprinkle throughout one of these books, is so that people don't have to read it as a traditional book. They can pick it up, flip it open to pretty much any page, and go from there. Or if they're just looking for information about a certain tour, say they're on YouTube listening to a show and they want to see, is there a review from that show? Flip it open to that page, and maybe there will be. And that was one of the main goals of that, is to bring all of this history into one place so that it can be a single reference and a single, well, I'm going to call it a single source of truth. And I certainly hope that it's as close to 100% as I can possibly make it, though I don't doubt that it does have some flaws, because that's just the nature of any historical work. We're going to be continuing to dig into the history of the band over the decades, and there's always new stuff surfacing.
You include an ad in the book from Columbia Records to promote the record. Aerosmith, refined raunch from Boston. Love that. That's great. Where did you get that from?
Oh, most of these trade ads will be coming out of Cream, Rolling Stone, or Billboard and Cashbox, some from Record World. You know, it's most of the big trade publications from about the time have the best trade ads with that sort of byline written on it. Refined raunch. I like that too.
Oh, yeah. The Bad Boys from Boston is the one that took off, but Refined Raunch from Boston, I love that. The album didn't take off, but it would get its due a few years later. Make It, Dream On, Mamakin, Walking the Dog on this one. The critics seem to like it. You include the reviews in the book, one saying there's nothing spectacular, but most of the reviews are good.
Yeah. For the most part, the importance of including album reviews is to set the context commercially for how these albums were received. Now, we all say the same thing about critics, and it's usually not polite, but they're writing for a wider audience in their newspapers, and it often varies from region to region. So it's useful to have them comparatively available for readers to see what were the main publications approaching this material with, what were the attitudes of regional newspapers, and I also include some college press in some of them as well to cover that aspect.
I just think it's cool that they got the good reviews right up front, because even bands like Led Zeppelin were getting nailed by the critics early on. And then years later, oh, they were great. Nirvana's first album was the famous Rolling Stone review, said it was average. And then years later they changed. But Aerosmith from the start, I think they were winning critics over. As far as the fans, they had a following here on the East Coast in New England, but nationwide that took a while. But they always had that solid fan base in New England.
That was the strategy of Lieber Krebs right from the beginning, that they wanted to start in Boston, in the region, build up to the state level, build up to New England, and then move to the Midwest. It was a strategy. It was a battle plan. There was very little luck. They made a market first and then moved on to the next market. They raped and pillaged across the country musically.
Interesting to see some of the bands Aerosmith opened for on that 73 tour. The Mahavishnu Orchestra, Sha Na Na. Any standout entries from that 73 tour?
Mott, the whole tour with Mott are the interesting dates because that's the first real tour where it feels like a tour. That's the first compatible billing. Mahavishnu, anything but compatible. And that's really, I think that's a deliberate decision, because if you're going to become a great performer, you got to face some adversity. You got to learn how to handle that negative crowd who's going to hate you no matter what. So I think that's the next step up from the grind in hotels and, woodshedding in public, is to go in front of a hostile audience on a hostile tour. And that's straight out of the bat. That is the first tour of 73. And then they move on to the Kinks. That's pretty hostile as well. Ray Davies was pretty hostile towards them and did not give them a lot of room, no sound checks. You would have thought musically much more compatible than Mahavishnu, stylistically, but it was anything but fun. Then you get into the summer, and the summer of 73 is still like 72 and 71 in many cases. It's not really a tour. They're filling in dates where they can, and then they do a few dates later on with the Dolls and then into the Mott.
Yeah, how many shows did they play with Mott the Hoople?
I think that's 27, 28.
So it's Mott the Hoople with Aerosmith and special guest stars New York Dolls. That's a show.
That's a great lineup. It depends which Dolls you got that night. If you got the 100% Dolls, then it would have been a good show. If you got the 10% Dolls, would have been a nightmare.
Yeah. Here's one, Mott the Hoople with Aerosmith, special guest star Marshall Tucker Band. That's another good lineup. Wow.
That's what we don't get these days. You don't get the lineups that you get a Marshall Tucker type band with Mott and Aerosmith. You don't get these interesting billings that would basically throw together bands that weren't necessarily completely compatible in terms of the musical genre they were kind of anchored in. You'd get more interesting combinations.
And what do you pay for a ticket for that show? $6. $6.
That would have been expensive on that.
Yeah, it ranges from $4 to $5 to $6. So the best seats are $6. Yeah, they played with Wishbone Ash, Argent. Yeah, they played with whoever they could play with. I mean, that's the thing again with Aerosmith. It was, we'll play wherever you'll have us. We'll play, and we'll.
Yeah, you put us on a bill. We'll play.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I like to advise readers of the book to kind of register. Look at some of the acts and bills that Aerosmith are playing with. Then go and check out some of the music for those acts. Because number one, you might discover something new that you'll like. Number two, you'll say, how on earth are they playing with that audience?
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. The band returns with 1974's Get Your Wings, which includes the Aerosmith classics, Same Old Song and Dance, Lord of the Thighs, a classic, Train Kept A-Rollin', Seasons of Wither, another deep track classic. But again, not a huge commercial success, but that day's coming. Meanwhile, the band has developed a loyal and growing fan base in the Northeast, and as you said, that was part of the plan. They sell out the Orpheum Theater in Boston 2 nights in a row. Capacity, 5,800. Not bad. They're on the same bill as Blue Oyster Cult, Deep Purple, and Kiss. Now this is an interesting story involving some punches thrown and knives being pulled. Can you talk about what you call Aerosmith versus Kiss Part 1?
This was going to be one of the most important intersections for my creativity. It takes the area that we know as Kiss fans, and having done a few books on Kiss, I've heard all the stories from the Kiss perspective. Having an opportunity to go and get the Aerosmith perspective for those stories was a gotta have in this book. So we get the knife fight. we get the story of what triggered it from the Aerosmith perspective, of what happened in the meeting in Detroit that was done to try and smooth over, and then how Aerosmith's crew won the day, whether Kiss knew it or not. And again, it's in the book, and I don't want to spoil too much of it because I think it's for people who've read the Kiss side of it, I think we finally have a full picture of what happens. And there's still a few voices. But also, again, I'm learning stuff about some of the Kiss crew in this that I didn't know beforehand. And I'm learning it from the Aerosmith crew. The crews of these bands in the 70s, these guys are the road warriors. These are the guys who make everything happen. Without them, the shows don't happen. So I wanted to speak to as many crew as I could. I didn't get as many as I wanted, but you know what? The ones I did get had gold to share about their time with the band. And it just gives you further respect about a band can only play if someone set up their stage. And that is seldom the band.
And I'm assuming Aerosmith versus Kiss Part 2 is the early 2000s tour?
No, Part 2 is further down. There's only 2 shows that Kiss and Aerosmith did together in the 70s. We'll get to 2003 in Volume 2 of the book, and that's much less interesting. There aren't any knives. There are just more lawyers.
Right, and a little bit of mudslinging, some quotes back and forth in the press between the two sides.
There was a little bit. I mean, even in the 70s, Stephen said, I don't know how Kiss does it. I could never come off stage dressed as a clown and no one recognized who I was.
Wow.
And it's a different perception of the art. And again, Kiss and Aerosmith are so intertwined in the 1970s in terms of Americana and pop culture that I had to cross over and have some Kiss in there. And at one point, my editor was telling me, you're using those little Kiss font logos way too much. Get rid of them.
Oh, I love that. I love the Kiss logo. Is he a Kiss fan?
Oh, yeah.
He is, and he still said that. Seeing these Connecticut venues is so cool. That's one thing the fans will love. Seeing places the band played in their hometown or city. Most of these venues no longer exist. One that does is Dillon Stadium in Hartford, Connecticut. August 26, 1974. Deep Purple the headliner, Elf the opening act. When and where did you see Aerosmith for the first time? What was your first Aerosmith concert?
Oh, it's a tale of woe and sorrow and not a few tears. You see, I'm not a big fan of concerts because I've got a problem with people. And lots of people. I didn't actually see them until 2003 when they toured with Kiss. So that was my first show, but I got my Gotta Have scratched at that show with Let the Music Do the Talking. So for me, because I don't go to a lot of shows or I buy a lot of concert tickets, I just don't then go to the concert because I can't face being in an audience. That's why I live vicariously through bootlegs. Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, you're not alone, though. There are people that love to go to concerts, and they will go to wherever they can go as often as they can go. But, you know, you're in good company because the great author Martin Popoff told me that once. He says, I'm not a concert guy. I'd much rather just stay at home and watch them on YouTube if I have to, or if they've got a professional release that comes out. I'll watch it there. I'm not big on concerts.
I'm with Martin on that. Give me a 78 soundboard to listen to, and I'll be happy as Larry. I don't need to go and see them in 2008, 2010. I was often in the wrong place at the wrong time. We go back to growing up in Binghamton, 78 to 88. I was too young to see them in 79 when they were there. I did buy a concert ticket to put in the book, but, you know, the nice part about the book is going to those entries for where you lived at the time and seeing if the show that you went to is listed. And that's what I hear is the first thing that most people do when they buy this book or any of the touring histories that I've done. They go and see, is my show in there and is it correct? Or I get an email saying, is the show in there? You know, and they tell me if I'm correct before they've even gone and bought it. So it's nice to go back and revisit that, or to read the review that you originally read back in the day after going to the show. And it's hilarious. I don't put all of it in the book. A lot of the back and forth that does follow of people writing letters to the editor and saying that reviewer who reviewed the Aerosmith show, I mean, he's a real hater. You know, he got it completely wrong. Stephen was fantastic that night. What's wrong with this guy? Why don't you send someone to the show who actually likes Aerosmith? So that's what the basis of the book is, and the purpose of it is to bring that available as a source. And as a guy from Binghamton as a teenager, I was really interested in the bands that came through Binghamton and to try and make sure that Binghamton was well covered in the book, because again, that was my hometown for 10 years and one that I still have affection for looking back to my teen years.
I'm surprised now. So Kiss, known obviously as an outstanding, classic, legendary live band. How many times have you seen Kiss live?
Like the books I've published on them, I've lost count. I think we're 27, 28. That's one I have suffered for. They were my number one. And, with doing a website on them for 25 years, it's so ingrained that I do make the sacrifice for fiscally and in terms of my sanity by going to the shows. With Aerosmith, I stayed out of the community. I stayed very separate to it because once you have a relationship in that community, it becomes a challenge with the projects that you work on. So it's better to be unknown in that community in some sense and let them then judge you for what you have tried to do creativity wise or in terms of research and analysis than to maybe not like you because you banned them on a message board.
I've seen Kiss many times, and it is an outstanding show. Outstanding. First concert I ever saw was a Kiss show without makeup, the old New Haven Coliseum. Was it the Hide Your Heart tour? 1989. Or no, it was 1990. I think they toured off that album, didn't they?
Yeah, the year after.
But of course, seeing them with makeup, woo, outstanding. I was telling you before we started recording, I've got a coworker who's never seen Kiss live. He's in his mid to late 20s, and his dad is a Kiss fan. So we're going to go see them in Hartford, Connecticut in May. And I'm just looking forward to seeing the look on his face as he's watching as the fire's coming up and Gene goes up on that platform, does his bass solo and spitting the blood. And it's quite an experience.
Yeah, I always describe it as worshiping at the altar and taking electric communion because it really is an event. And again, it's like it is for, I'm sure, Aerosmith fans. These shows I've been to, there are the groups of fans that meet up at the shows. So here it is an amazing event to go and see a band live. And a legendary band is a legendary band, whether it's Aerosmith, whether it's Kiss, and it's sure to be good fun.
We're talking with Julian Gill, whose new book, Aerosmith on Tour, 1973 to 85, is out now. Aerosmith's days as an opening act were about to end, and the breakthrough studio album they were looking for finally happens with 1975's Toys in the Attic. Walk This Way, a big hit. Sweet Emotion, another big hit. And as we mentioned before, Dream On is now getting airplay, and that's becoming a hit. Suddenly, Aerosmith is one of rock's biggest bands. Rocks, released in 1976, goes all the way to number 3 on the charts, 8 spots higher than Toys in the Attic. Last Child, Back in the Saddle, top 40 hits. But the drugs and the fast-paced life on the road start to catch up to the band around 1977.
Rocks is the high point, literally and figuratively. They're still functional, but they are dabbling deeply with the demons there. So while their creativity is heightened and you end up with a fantastic bit of product like Rocks, which no superlatives really do it justice as an album, it is the high point of their career, recording-wise. But that tour is on a downward trajectory. And I think Nightbob's quotes sum it up best. Once they get to Japan, they're fried. Again, literally and figuratively. They have a drug-free experience in Japan, and then they come back, and it's back into rinse and repeat. Now you're going back into pre-production, generate another album, get back out on the road. And David Krebs is quoted in the book, direct quotes, about what he would have done in hindsight to make things different. But maybe it's all irrelevant in hindsight because there was no coming back from where they'd gone. All those challenges that they had interpersonally were present at that first show. The friction, the kind of constant needling, but it all became magnified throughout the years. And then, of course, drugs and money come into the picture. And when you add both of those two, and any personality crisis is going to become magnified.
This is surprising that Rocks charted higher than Toys in the Attic, because Toys in the Attic, to me, is my personal favorite album, and I know a lot of Aerosmith's fans will say I think this is them at their peak. Are you a fan more of Rocks or Toys in the Attic? What's the better album?
for my taste, I'll take Rocks any day of the week. My two albums are going to be Get Your Wings and Rocks. Toys is just as good, but if I'm picking my favorite children, well, I'm going to pick the two on the end. Again, it's a matter of taste. They're all chock full of hits. They're all chock full of catalog classics that are played to this day if they were able to tour or wanted to. So it's not about the songs. Give me the production on Rocks. Starting out at the Warehouse and the recording of it is just perfection to my ears, that you've got organic band basis on which everything is being layered, which is different than how Toys in the Attic was constructed. So Rocks benefits not only from being a strong album, having more radio-friendly singles than Toys did, they're benefiting from Dream On hitting. Dream On is released again at the end of 75, and it starts charting in January of 76. That is the perfect time for that song to become a hit. They're off the road. They're writing an album. They're recording. And it's becoming their biggest hit to date right at the time that they're about to release the album. So Rocks benefits more from Dream On than anything else, I think. I think it benefits more from Dream On success than it does from anything that they built during Toys in the Attic. But everything was building towards that one moment where they came crashing through the speakers and hit.
Rats in the Cellar. What a great track. Back in the Saddle, Last Child, Rats in the Cellar off of that. Sick as a Dog, Nobody's Fault, Get the Let Out, Licking a Promise, Home Tonight. Yeah, I mean, you make a good argument for that. Toys in the Attic is still my go-to, but those albums were all great, and as you said, even though some of the cracks are starting to show, they're still putting up big numbers in concert as we get to the late 70s. And as we know, in the 70s, live albums were a big thing. And Aerosmith's live bootleg released in the fall of 78, number 13, 22 weeks on Billboard. Where do you place that live album among the other notables from the decade? You got Kiss Alive. I know that wasn't really live, but still, great album. You've got Frampton Comes Alive. Where do you put Aerosmith's live bootleg among those?
I don't put it in the company of any of those live albums because it just doesn't work for me on that level. Give me one of the live soundboards from 78 in its entirety. Give me Philadelphia. Give me Cleveland. I don't care. Give me one of those, not the edited version that you get on live bootleg. It's a great representation of what they were at that time. But I want the full honesty of a full record. I'm not saying Kiss Alive's honest, because we know it's not. But I would much rather just enjoy a full show from 78 than something that's so shortened. And some of the songs that are left off it are just egregious omissions.
This is where we first hear Chip Away the Stone, right? This is from that album?
That's right.
Can you talk about the show from October of 1978 in Fort Wayne, Indiana? The News Sentinel headline the next morning, Scores arrested at concert, Aerosmith helps bail out fans. What happens that night?
Yeah, so Fort Wayne's a tough place to play, and the police are pretty heavy with the crowd. And a lot of the crowd are getting arrested for minor infractions, and probably major infractions as well. Come on, it was the 70s. And Stephen is confrontational with the police and authorities, even stadium officials at shows he wasn't a big fan of. So there's a back and forth, and the band does something smart. They send one of their guys down to bail out all the fans who got arrested at that show. It makes the press, and for the rest of 1978, in a newspaper somewhere, you'll be reading about Aerosmith bailing out its fan. What a great bit of PR as well.
July 28th, 1979, a day the band would much rather forget. Cleveland's Municipal Stadium, billed as the World Series of Rock. Aerosmith on the same bill as Ted Nugent, Journey, Thin Lizzy, AC/DC, Scorpions. Over 65,000 fans. There's violence outside the stadium, a shooting death, robberies, beatings. This is also Joe Perry's final concert as a member of Aerosmith until 1984. This is where, as Steven Tyler once said, he and Joe split up over spilt milk. Before the show, I think it was Tom Hamilton's wife, Terry, got into it with Joe Perry's wife, Alyssa. Alyssa throws a glass of milk at Terry. Steven says to Joe, "Control your wife." And then Joe gets pissed. He quits the band soon after. And you include a quote from Joe in your book. Basically, he's saying, we should have just taken a break and everything would have been cool. If only, right?
That's what members of the crew are saying. That's what managers are saying. But everything's so easy to say in hindsight. You know what? That show had a lot of what was wrong with the band from day one coming to a crescendo. All the bickering, all the conflict. It wasn't just the band members, but the band members themselves must have been so tired from just living on the road. I love the story of one of them waking up at home and reaching for the phone and calling room service, and they're at home. They've forgotten what it's like to live a normal life and be at home and not be writing an album, recording an album, going on tour, or doing pre-production for a tour. It must have become almost comically torturous in many ways, and then to rinse and repeat the cycle again and again, and to be dragging around tapes trying to record an album, which happened in both 77 and 79. They're trying. You got to give Aerosmith props. They tried. They kept going. They kept trying to deliver, but at the end, the pieces were just too broken to keep functioning. You know, it's like a car. That wheel finally gets a flat and that thing's not going any further, and you got to change the wheel. The business relationships come into play as well as a driving factor. In doing the books on both Kiss and Aerosmith, you have a lot of contrast between big organizations in the background, the management and production companies, whether it's Auckland Management for Kiss and Lieber Krebs for Aerosmith, that become a microcosm of the industry itself, where they're trying to develop other bands and using their more successful bands to fund those less successful bands in an attempt to break those other bands to continue feeding the monster. So on one level, it's a self-defeating prophecy in many ways that they have to drive on their most successful acts to keep producing, to keep money coming in. Touring revenue is massive compared to record sale revenues, though certainly in the 70s, the record royalties were going more in the direction of the management companies in many cases than to the actual artists themselves. I don't know the full business arrangements for any of these bands that I've worked on, but you always get that sense that that is what's driving the need on these bands is money. It's fiscal. And that's when you hear about band members being in debt and some of the weird financial relationships that are just not in the purview of fans to find out when writing about, that become complex. So when a band breaks up and members start leaving, it's hardly surprising.
Even though Joe is gone, Aerosmith did forge on. Night in the Ruts, 1979. That's an album that Joe Perry intended to be a part of instead. They get some fill-in musicians to fill out the vacancy left by Joe, and then Jimmy Crespo is hired as Joe's replacement. This is where the band finds themselves in smaller venues. Things start to get scary. December 6th of 79 at a show in Maine, Steven Tyler passes out on stage. In your chapter on that 79 tour, just flipping through the pages, and it's filled with canceled, postponed, canceled, postponed. Now, these weren't all due to Steven's health, but it's indicative of where the band was at that time. Nothing was going their way at this point. Meanwhile, Joe Perry launches his solo career. You include his dates as well in the book. His first gig, November 16th, 1979, at Boston University. There's about 3,400 people in attendance, and that includes members of Aerosmith. Steven Tyler was there. Do you think that they were there to support Joe? Were they just curious? Were they hoping he'd failed so he'd come back? What do you think was going on there?
I think at that point, they're not hoping that he fails and comes back because the splits just happened and it is still raw to a certain extent. You know, again, we go back to some of the business things that we're just not privy to. I think there was some element of support and curiosity. You know, what is he going to do now? And which ones of those songs were ones that should have been recorded by Aerosmith? So a certain amount of interest, and then also probably a certain amount of need to be seen. 79 is weird. I had to include Joe Perry Project because I love that band. I love that music. And I didn't want to exclude Joe Perry's solo career because it's part of the story of how they come back together as well. So that meant I had to do the research as much as I could on all of those solo dates for 5 years. So I think it's an important part of the book to include. And the solo career, again, everyone has their own opinion about which of the songs that probably should have been recorded by Aerosmith. But I just want to go back to Aerosmith 79 tour as well. 79 was a very challenging time economically. So they picked a pretty bad time to tank. There was more going on in the country economically than just Aerosmith becoming less popular. And Joe had recorded most of the album with them. There are bits and pieces finished off by others. But, the vast majority of Night in the Ruts is Joe.
Which is the song that both Aerosmith and Joe Perry recorded? Was it Let the Music Do the Talking?
Let the Music Do the Talking and Bone to Bone.
Okay, so they both recorded their own versions?
Yeah, Joe did his as an instrumental.
Interesting. I just try to imagine there's a brotherhood there, and I always get the sense those two guys, they love each other as much as they hate each other. So that's why I'm just curious I'm trying to picture what that would have been like. Steven Tyler there watching Joe Perry. And is Joe Perry looking over and
did he stay and watch? Did he stay and watch the show is the question. I think that's answered in the book as well with a quote.
Thankfully, Joe rejoins the band February of 1984. The first Aerosmith show featuring the return of Joe Perry is June 22nd, 1984 at the Capitol Theater in New Hampshire. A perfect set opener, back in the saddle, and they were. A great review followed. Aerosmith begin their ascent back to the top. So looking back on the tours from 73 to 85, what would be the absolute best tour, in your opinion?
Well, I think I've already mentioned those Spring 78 shows, which are obviously being recorded for live bootleg, but that they're playing at that time are just killer. And the power and ferocity that they're playing with. I mean, if you want better, you're really going to find something in 75. But again, you don't have all the catalog being represented. So I'm going to cop out and say 78 because I'm going to get my cake. I'm going to get to eat it. I'm going to get to lick the icing as well by having as many of the songs from their history performed at that time. Whereas if I say 75, it may be a great show. It may be raw, but it's going to be missing some stuff that comes later that I love.
So the plan is now to eventually follow up with another book, which would begin with, I believe, that Permanent Vacation tour in 1987, right?
No, it starts with Done with Mirrors. Done with Mirrors got cut from this due to space limitations. I don't want this binding snapping in half. It's already bad enough as it is at 600 pages. So I cut Done with Mirrors, and it also makes more sense at the Geffen years to segregate Columbia and Geffen, keep them separate because those two weren't getting along the greatest at the time. Volume 2 is already well advanced. There's 450 pages already written in that. It's going to go up through 2007. We'll see Space-wise may go 2008, but I kind of want to cut off at the Guitar Hero era, which is when I really kind of checked out. I want to take it all the way there through Honkin' on Bobo, even Just Push Play. I mean, it's really interesting. It's a good chapter on when things start not working so well.
In the later years, the big thing would be how many of the deep tracks are they going to put in there for the hardcore fans? It gets to the point where there are those standard handful of songs, maybe more. You got to play them. So that leaves how much room for deep tracks? They've had some shows, though, where they put in some good ones. Like what was it? Maybe a few years ago, they did Uncle Salty live. They try to cater to the hardcore fans, but at the same time, it's the same problem Kiss has. You got to play Rock and Roll All Night. We've all heard it a million times, but if you don't play it, there's going to be a revolt. Set list is an interesting challenge for bands that have been around for a while.
It has, and it is, but I think Aerosmith, pound for pound, has done a way better job of balancing their core catalog with the stuff that came after. I think they got to a point where they recognized that they were making albums not necessarily for the fans anymore. So you get a lot of really interesting set combinations continuing to appear. And you also get some pretty weird choices off the current albums. So while those albums aren't selling like the early Geffen albums were, like hotcakes, they're still making sure you hear those songs. And a lot of those songs sound way better live anyway than they ever did on album.
What did you think of Music from Another Dimension? That's the 2012 album. They brought back Jack Douglas to produce, but it did not do well. I enjoyed it. I liked it. Surprised that it didn't do that well. I was working in radio at the time. Legendary Child, we played that as a single for like 4 weeks, and then it dropped. And I was bummed because I was so excited for that return. What did you think of it?
First 8 songs are fantastic. It gets a bit bloated and a bit overbearing, especially the version of the album I've got, which is 17 tracks long. The filler is better as B-sides, and as a B-side collector, it kind of took the fun out of it, having it all available. But it's a hodgepodge. It's stuff from all over their career that hadn't necessarily been finished. I think some of it going back as early as 73. So from that perspective, it's fascinating. And there's some really, really good stuff musically on there. But the industry had changed. The fans had changed. The consumption of music had changed. Radio was becoming a problem in the 90s in terms of it becoming homogenized, the playlist, and it becoming monopolized. So it's not gotten any better. Aerosmith had its moments and its days, and I think by the time that album finally comes out, I think they'd missed the final opportunity to really do that album. If it had come out sooner than later than when it did come out, I don't know if it would have mattered, but I think it might have had slightly more legs than it ultimately had.
I'm glad you said that because a lot of people were trying to analyze the music itself and try to find the problem in the music. And people were trying to figure out why the album didn't do so well. And their first assumption was, well, it's got to be the songs. Something's not right with it. The magic's not there anymore. But you're so right. It's timing. At that time, classic rock radio was not welcoming anything new from these heritage artists, as you would call them. And there were, like you said, the audience got older. Even some of the fans who would say, I love Aerosmith, but they'd say, I'm not really interested in hearing anything new from them. So it had nothing to do with the music. It just has to do with where we were at that time. But
yeah, did Van Halen's album do any better?
Another great example. And that's a great album, A Different Kind of Truth. I think it came same year, 2012.
The moment these guys got their own studios, it really helped musically. And I think when we look at an album like Music from Another Dimension, that it exists is victory enough for me as a fan. I'm happy that after all those years of talking, like Chinese Democracy, a studio album from Aerosmith appeared and was done, and that it had elements going back to many eras in their history that I could go back and enjoy, that we could decipher, oh, that was a demo done for Get a Grip. Oh, wait, no, it had been revamped from the Pump era. You know, that sort of thing's really cool to a diehard fan. Most of the people who are consuming music don't care. They're going to play it on Spotify. The artist isn't going to get paid, and they're going to move on and go and listen to Adele.
I wish all of my bands that I love were like Cheap Trick. They just crank out album after album, and the fans love every single album that comes out.
They don't have the dynamic problems internally that some of these more fossilized bands seem to have. They've gone from being dinosaurs to being fossils in the market. Not to us as fans. They'll never be fossils to us, but we'll always see them in sepia to a certain extent when we look in our minds.
Where will we be 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I think it's at this point, it's the tribute bands and tribute acts that are going to play an important role. I guess, you know, like Kiss is going to be most likely a Kiss 2.0.
I'd rather have the archives.
Yeah.
Give me the archives instead of the tribute bands. Kiss 2.0, forget it. Aerosmith 2.0. No, these bands, the components are individuals. At the end of the day, if Aerosmith could end on a high note of getting those 5 guys in the same room with a good producer and recording all of those songs that they performed at their first show and some of the other stuff that they did in 71, just live without doing bits and pieces in Pro Tools and all that crap that just sucks the organic sound out of the music. Forget Music from Another Dimension and the way that's recorded. Go back, press play on the recorder. Go straight to analog. Do it traditional. Do it because you guys love performing together. It's not going to sell 10 million copies. It's not going to move like an album like Get a Grip did worldwide. Do it because you have passion for the music. And if not, I'll go and throw on Whitford St. Holmes reunion album. There's still good music to be enjoyed. I'll go play that new Cheap Trick album. Hell, that's a damn good album.
Sure. So let's wind down. There is also a companion website that you created to go along with this book. That's aerosmithontour.com. What can fans find there?
Not a whole lot right now, but it's slowly being populated with the nuts and bolts of the book. It's important to not only have the book available, all packaged up and bound and pretty with photos and all that stuff in it, but the data is really for everyone, and it's already being cut and pasted into some of the other aggregators out there that love that sort of data. So information has to be free. The art may not be free. So if you want to have a bound copy that you could take into the loo with you, well, that's available on Amazon. And if you want just the data, I'll slowly get it all up there, including the narrative chapters. As much of it that can be put into an online format that makes sense will go online for free for people to enjoy.
There is a link to buy the book, Aerosmith on Tour 1973 to 85, through Amazon on that website, so people can go there. You've also set up a Facebook page and a YouTube channel, so you've got all the links on that website. Again, that's over at aerosmithontour.com. Any other websites, social media pages that you want to plug? Of course, the KISSFAQ podcast. That's a weekly podcast, right?
It's weekly or whenever we get around to it. We try and get together as much as possible. I do plan on doing some Aerosmith podcast episodes, looking to put together a crew to kind of go album by album, topic by topic on that. Now I'm winding down a series on Wasp on one of my other partner shows. So I stay away from Twitter. I don't do Instagram. I don't post a lot on Facebook. I try and share the bare minimum, what I'm working on. I celebrate certain days when I remember, there's a cool ad for that show on that date. I'll throw it up on the Facebook page. But that's more a place to check out what I'm up to, where I'm at with the next volume. I've just debuted the artwork for volume 2 there in the past week. And that's where you can find me.
Cool. Is there a planned release date for the next Aerosmith book, or is that to be determined?
No, the last one was supposed to be out in November of 2020, and with plagues and whatnot, things didn't quite go to plan. So, I wouldn't expect it before the first half of 2023. But then again, there's a lot of core and critical interviews that I do want to try and do for this one as well.
Do you self-publish your books, all of them?
Yeah, I'm completely self-published. I only ever once used a vanity press, and that was a nightmare. So I do all my own photo licensing, permissions, artwork commissions. I do want to give a shout out to the cover artist, Chris Hoffman, who's done an absolutely fantastic job interpreting what started out as a basic idea by me and really kicking it up to a different level. He's got a website. You can Google Chris Hoffman art, and his website, I think he has prints available of the cover art for both Volume 1 and Volume 2 without the titles, and that's the only place that you'll see those.
Oh, I could put a link up on the show notes page too. And you did get the thumbs up from Mr. Greg Prado, who's a big fan of yours, because he gave it a nice review, this book, on Amazon. So
He did, but he's a classy fella.
He is. I'm looking forward to having Greg back on the podcast. Well, Julian, thanks so much for being on the podcast, and it was great to meet you.
Awesome. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it. Good to meet you as well.
Many thanks to Julian Gill for taking us through his book, Aerosmith on Tour, 1973 to 85. If you have a local independent bookstore, pick up a copy there and support not just Julian, but your local independent bookstore. A link to find your nearest bookstore is on our website, bookedonrock.com. Make sure you subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. We're on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, TuneIn, YouTube, and more. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrockpodcast and on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address is thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. If you're a publisher or author of a book and you want to be on the podcast, send me an email or contact me through our website, bookedonrock.com. I'm Eric Senich. Look forward to having you back again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.